Hey everyone, and welcome to my B&B Glow channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Electra stops Bridget revealing the DNA test results. She announces she is also pregnant. Electra said the sentence in a voice that scraped the air, "I'm pregnant." The words did not simply land, they detonated, a controlled demolition in miniature that changed the architecture of the conversation in ways that none of the assembled could have prepared for. Someone's coffee cup fell from a side table, shattering into a constellation of small, white shards that seemed to mirror the splintering of alliances. Katie's hand flew to her mouth, a small animal sound of shock escaping her before rationality could form. Will, who had been standing with that particular stillness men take when they think they have been handed a neat problem, staggered as if someone had shoved him. Bridget's fingers whitened on the folder, and in that instant a dozen separate human histories slammed together, months of whispered conjecture about paternity, the weight of friendships negotiated on trust and fear, the legal and moral machinery that hovered like a specter in the background. Electra's eyes were wet with something fierce, an embrace of the truth and a plea to have its revelation situated in care, and as the room tried to reorganize itself around this sudden new axis, she added with a brittle, instructive cadence, "This means you don't get to weaponize what's in that folder. We're not airing this in a way that will hurt a baby before they can even understand the world. If the test is valid and the truth must be known, then it will be known in the light of the law and with due regard for the child, and not as a public spectacle." Her words were a call to arms for those who had been sitting on the fence. They were also a slap to those for whom the seductive allure of scandal had been an easy way to make sense of messy feelings. For a long beat there was silence heavy enough to listen to. It vibrated with the kind of moral argument that often in soap opera life only plays out over weeks of cliffhangers and courtroom scenes, but Electra's revelation and her plea condensed it into a single instant of high drama that made the small living room look like a town square in which a populace had gathered to witness a crisis of conscience. And then the small, human reactions, the ones that make melodrama feel real, began to unfurl. Bridget's face moved through a dozen emotions in the space of a few heartbeats. Anger that she had been stopped, a clawing need to protect truth, and beneath that a dawning recognition that perhaps there were tenderer ways to proceed that she had not considered when estranged loyalties hardened her into a crusader for disclosure. She wanted to read the test aloud, to place inked proof on the table and let the family rearrange themselves around facts rather than speculation, but Electra's hand on the folder made the proposition physically difficult. The gesture acted like a small veto, one that turned the argument from purely evidentiary into profoundly ethical. "Bridget," Electra said softly, as if to apologize while insisting on a boundary, "I know why you have it. I know you want clarity. God knows I'm not a fan of obfuscation. But there are timing and method issues. There are laws and labs and chain of custody details that will not only determine whether the results are admissible, they will dictate whether a child has to suffer the consequences of adults rushing to judgment." This last sentence landed on someone like a blast of winter air. Katie, who had often promoted decisiveness when she believed it was moral, found herself split. One half of her wanted the folder opened and the truth unfurled so that Will's confusion could be settled. The other half, maternal and tender, recoiled at the specter of a newborn being hurled into public confusion. Brooke and Ridge, who had both been spectators and participants in the tapestry of family scandals for years, exchanged a look that was equal parts calculation and empathy. Ridge's jaw worked as if he was physically chewing the problem into smaller, more manageable pieces, while Brooke's eyes glittered with an old care that had long ago been trained to spot the human cost of headlines. But Electra's announcement carried its own complications. The room now had to absorb two detonations: the possibility that the DNA results might reassign paternity in ways that would fracture claims and obligations, and the fact that a new life, Electra's baby, was about to enter the calculus, which meant that any legal maneuvers would have to consider custody, visitation, and the moral duty adults have to shield children from the worst of their battles. Carter, who had been a lodestone of pragmatic compassion after his own romantic storms, felt his protector instincts engage. He stepped closer to Electra as if proximity could act as a defense and said, "Then we do this right. We secure the sample. We rerun the test under court supervision. We do not let rumors and tabloids decide a child's reality." His words were met with a mix of relief and suspicion. relief because the language of procedure can calm a room by replacing emotion with process, suspicion because in this family process is often a battleground disguised as administration. Thomas, who had spent half his life learning how to parry words into advantage, frowned and muttered about the legal ramifications. Will this announcement forestall immediate disclosure or will it be used as a scythe to carve public sympathy? He could already see the story arcs, the strategic moves and countermoves that would define the next season of their lives. Meanwhile, Steffi looked at Electra and, for once, her expression was stripped of the calculating cool she often wore. There was only a raw empathy that read like a woman who had been wounded by family and scandal and who recognized that this moment contained more risk than any courtroom. She moved to Electra's side and, quietly, said, "We'll make sure you're okay. We'll protect you." Those words, small, intimate, human, provided Electra with an anchor that allowed her to regain composure and then, with a steadier voice, add an instruction, "Bridget, you promised me you'd consider the child when you found out." We all agreed that the truth was necessary, but that it had to be pursued responsibly. I'm asking you now, in front of everyone, to honor that. The request was a moral lever, it asked for charity and accountability in equal measure. Bridget's hands unclenched slightly and for a moment it seemed she might fold the folder closed, return it to her purse, and leave the truth to the quieter corridors of the legal system. Yet the human need for closure is stubborn, secrets can feel like tumors that pressure internal organs until someone insists on excision, and once someone has the kind of evidence that can answer an aching doubt it is almost impossible to set it aside. This is where the explosive, cinematic fighting the show is famous for erupted, not in a single bar of raised voices but in a multiplicity of skirmishes that attacked the problem from every angle, moral, legal, emotional, and practical. Katie, feeling the moral ember of betrayal, accused Electra of using her pregnancy as a shield, of staging revelation to deflect the knife of disclosure. "How do we know this isn't timing?" she demanded, leaning forward, voice edged with hurt that had spent years learning how to be reasonable. "You announce you're pregnant at the exact moment a folder that could upend families is about to be opened? What are you trying to hide?" Electra's eyes flashed the twin lights of righteous hurt and exhausted patience. "I am trying to protect a child who has no say in our mess," she said, and her tone cut the room in a way that made some lean toward her and others away. Brooke, who had the matriarch's instinct to smooth but also the iron resolve to protect family and reputation, asked a pointed question about timing. Had Electra known the folder's contents before she made her announcement? The subtext was merciless. If she had coordinated the two revelations, then perhaps the pregnancy was being wielded strategically. Electra's answer, that she had known only that Bridget had the test, not what it contained, was met with mixed credibility. People wanted proof that she had not manufactured the revelation as a decoy, and suspicion can be a curious thing, wound tight in the fabric of families where secrets have been currency for generations. As accusations flew, a new set of practical concerns also demanded immediate resolution. Who would be entrusted with the physical DNA sample? Where was the original vial? Had chain of custody been maintained? Carter and Ridge both spoke up in the language of logistics. Let us secure the sample, create an inventory, find independent labs, seal things in the presence of counsel, and their procedural calm offered a temporary island of sense. But the path to forensic certainty is slow and litigious, tests can be contested, vials can be challenged, and the spectacle of a family's private matters becoming the subject of subpoenas and depositions had been played out in their circle before with dreadful consequences. Ridge's insistence on legal oversight hinted at a strategy to maintain control over the narrative. If the family vets the lab and controls the release of results, they can manage the fallout. Thomas, eyes alight with scheming energy, suggested that whoever had an early advantage, whether to public sympathy or legal standing, could leverage it to secure stronger positions for corporate influence and social legitimacy. The conversation quickly became a chess match where personal stakes, maternal identity, paternal rights, a newborn's sense of belonging, were weighed alongside more perfunctory but no less deadly calculations about inheritance, public perception, and the balance of power in the family's sprawling business interests. In that crucible, the lines between moral urgency and strategic calculation blurred. and the cacophony of voices sometimes read less like mourning than like a war council composed of people who'd long ago learned that appearances could be as valuable as virtues. Outside the house, the engines of spectacle started quickly. An anonymous tip, slipped to a reporter who had long since cultivated the family as a reliable source of dramatic headlines, surfaced within hours. Pregnancy coincides with DNA revelation, timing suspicious, the headline read, and social media, with its title appetite for scandal, churned with conjecture, hashtags proliferated, Twitter threads speculated, and opinion pieces were drafted before the family could agree on a unified response. The result of public exposure is predictable. In a place where celebrities are both revered and devoured, the stakes shifted instantly. What had been a private matter now risked becoming press copy, soundbites that could not capture the complexity of motives but would feed the public's appetite for simple, moral narratives, villain and hero, liar and martyr, guilty and innocent. It became crucial for the family to control the narrative while simultaneously doing right by the child Electra would give birth to, and that is a nearly impossible moral calculus when reputations and livelihoods are at stake. Conversations that might have taken place in a counselor's office over the span of months were condensed into immediate decisions: who speaks to the media, when, and with what message, who remains silent to protect the child's privacy, and who must be the voice of legal prudence to keep courts from being swayed by sentiment. Legal counsel quickly became central. The family's lawyers convened, calibrated, and advised on next steps: independent forensic testing, non-disclosure agreements to prevent leaks, and a court petition to determine custody and visitation protocols if the DNA results would reassign paternal rights. The law's cold typography, motions, affidavits, subpoenas, seemed designed to exorcise emotion, translating the roiling lives of people into exhibits and sworn statements. There's an odd cruelty in that conversion. It makes the messy, human truth printable and digestible to a judge but often strips context from actions that were made out of love, fear, or 100 small, inadequate virtues. The legal battle that inevitably followed would be played out in the highly performative medium of testimony, where people would be asked to recall conversations that took place in trust, where questions would be framed to trap motives, and where the question of intent, did someone deliberately mislead, would be crucible. Luna, who had sat in another living room that week listening to whispered versions of what could only be a family implosion, tweeted with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned how careful public statements must be. In a town like theirs, law is only half the measure, reputation and narrative are the other half, and both are instruments of power. But amidst the legal and media frenzy, the personal heartbreaks and small acts of tenderness continued to define the human core of the story. Electra, for all the strategic potency of her revelation, was also, quietly and fiercely, terrified: fear for her child, for being judged as someone who could manipulate truth, for the very human shame that comes from being at the center of a family's rupture. She required not only legal counsel but also a circle of people willing to hold her when the cameras were not watching: Steffi's hand on the small of her back during a late-night conversation, Carter bringing over homemade soup as if a bowl could stabilize a life, and a midnight conversation with Bridget in which apologies were traded like currency and yet sometimes felt inadequate. Bridget, for all her crusading instincts, found an unexpected tenderness in Electra's fear and confessed, in a moment of private recognition, that she had feared being the enforcer of pain and had rationalized her action as justice rather than a cause of hurt. "I thought truth was the only moral currency," she whispered, "but now I see truth has to be administered gently, like medicine." Electra pressed her forehead to Bridget's for a long moment and said, "Then let's do it right." That private reconciliation, taken not as a public absolution but as a pact between women in the eye of the storm, was perhaps the most radical element of the evening because it suggested a way forward rooted in empathy rather than in spectacle. As days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of the dual revelations produced multiple mini-wars. There were fights about hospitals and prenatal care, who would be present at ultrasounds, whether the child's paternity should be publicly identified on hospital documents, and whether midwives or doctors could be subpoenaed into family squabbles. There were tactical fights about schooling, what to tell older children in the family about the situation in age-appropriate ways, and whether the children's friends would ask questions that were cruel or insensitive. There were the old, raw fights about trust: who had kept secrets, who had colluded in silence, and whether the culture of privacy that had once preserved reputations was now a moral failing because it had allowed children to grow up without knowing important truths. In corporate corridors, the revelations fallout played a different game: questions about succession, reputation risk, the use of family trauma as part of a brand narrative. Board members worried that investor confidence might wobble if tabloids painted their house as a den of scandal rather than of creative genius. And in that world, the power players moved in subtle ways. Allies were called to tea, reputational guardrails were proposed, and some began quietly to prepare contingency plans that would preserve the family's assets independent of the outcome of the custody fights. In the courtroom, when the matter finally did arrive, drama turned into testimony and testimony into the grinding, unglamorous business of sworn memory. Experts were called to speak of laboratory protocol and the possibility of contamination. Nurses were asked to recall paperwork signatures. Family members were cross-examined on their motives and the sequence of events that led to the dramatic revelations. The judge, who had seen many human tragedies pass before a gavel, admonished both sides to remember the children in their rhetoric, yet the legal theater is seldom gentle, and the court of law's focus on admissible evidence often feels like a blunt instrument by which human motives are measured. Blood does not make love, no judge can make it so, but blood can determine legal obligations, and when law intersects with family life the stakes become existential. Visitation rights, child support, and the legal recognition of parenthood are the levers by which practical life is structured. For Electra, each procedural hearing was a public act that made her private pregnant body a sight of spectacle. For Bridget, the trial was a test of whether the truth would be recognized without cruelty. For Will, it was an unbearable premium on his identity as a father if the truth were otherwise. The verdicts and settlements, whatever they might be, would not contain the emotional fallout that would take years of therapy, acts of contrition, and the slow ritual of proving through care rather than argument that love is the thing that confers parenthood more tangibly than a lab number might. And so the story bent back on itself, caught between the need to be honest and the impulse to protect. Electra's pregnancy had interrupted a potential public unmasking and forced the family to pivot from spectacle to stewardship, but it had not erased the need for truth. It had complicated matters by adding a living, vulnerable human to the equation. A child who would inherit not only genes but also scars and stories. The family had to prove that it could be larger than its worst impulses and that the labor of caring for children should take precedence over the appetite for moral certainty or revenge. That labor looked like small things, not grand declarations on television but the patient work of attending prenatal appointments, securing legal protections that prioritized the child's stability, drafting family statements that protected privacy while admitting the reality of the dispute, and most of all, sitting down in quiet rooms with therapists to learn how to tolerate ambiguity and fear without lashing out. In soap worlds like theirs, time does not erase scandal but it does reframe it. Later seasons show repaired alliances, earlier enemies become unlikely allies, and children, those resilient, astonishing characters at the center of every moral plot, grow with a complexity that reflects the way adults finally reckon with their own mistakes. By the time the dust settled into a new, imperfect normal, the family had been transformed in ways both subtle and monumental. Legal outcomes would be mixed, a negotiated settlement here, a retest there, an agreement about custody that tried as best it could to prioritize the child's well-being, but the emotional labor of repair would remain ongoing. Electra's baby, when born, would enter a world where adults had been forced into accountability. Whether the child's early life would be defined by scandal or by the quiet rotations of daily tenderness would depend on the choices the adults continued to make. Bridget and Electra would, in time, forge a complicated if genuine friendship, stitched from apologies and small acts of trust. Will would learn how to be a father in a new vocabulary that sometimes included legal restraint and sometimes did not. Katie would have to decide whether her instinct to call the police in moments of perceived threat served justice or spectacle, and whether restraint might sometimes be the truer protection. And the extended family would learn that love can be both a reason and an excuse for secrecy, and that moral courage often looks like waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth rather than demanding that it be a weapon. The revelation that started as a potential grenade of public humiliation had become instead the beginning of a narrative about repair, about the hard work of preserving children's dignity in the face of adult failings, and about the possibility that truth, when pursued in love rather than in triumph, can shape futures in ways that headlines never could capture. The night Electra stopped Bridget, placed a hand on a folder and announced that she was pregnant, would be remembered not merely as a dramatic pivot in their lives but as the moment when a family decided to make a child the axis of their moral universe rather than the fulcrum of their scandal, a choice that, while messy and imperfect, hinted at the kind of humanity that soap operas, at their best, like to imagine. Flawed people trying, again and again, to choose care over spectacle, duration over victory, and the slow, patient labor of repair over the quick satisfaction of public judgment.